From New York, this is Democracy Now!
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
President Biden pledges to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war on Yemen, describing it as a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. But will the U.S. move actually end the six-year war? Plus, we look at whether President Biden will reverse Trump's recognition of Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara, Africa's last colony. But first, we go to Ethiopia to speak with the head of the African CDC. It's 4 years old today. As a South African variant of COVID-19 is spreading, African nations are racing to secure vaccines, but it could take months, if not years.
The continent recognizes that the global victory against COVID has to be guided by global solidarity because this is a global crisis and no country will be considered free of COVID. If any country in the world is considered, it still has COVID infections.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Joe Biden pledged Thursday to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, describing it as a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. The war, which began 6 years ago and was supported by both Presidents Obama and Trump, has devastated Yemen, leaving at least 100,000 people dead. According to the United Nations, 80% of Yemen's 30 million people need some form of aid or protection. Biden's pledge came during a major foreign policy speech Thursday in which he vowed to get tough on adversaries like China and Russia while declaring America is back. We'll have more on Biden's foreign policy plan and the war on Yemen later in the broadcast. The United States reported more than 5,000 coronavirus deaths Thursday, a world record daily toll since the start of the pandemic. Daily confirmed cases continue to fall but remain stubbornly high, with nearly 130,000 new infections over the most recent 24-hour period. On Thursday, Johnson & Johnson asked the Food and Drug Administration for emergency use authorization of its single-shot COVID-19 vaccine. In a large clinical trial, the vaccine prevented 85% of severe cases of the disease. There were no deaths. In Tampa, Florida, the NFL has set official attendance at the Super Bowl at 25,000 fans. 30,000 cardboard cutouts will fill the other seats. It will be the densest crowd of any pro football game since the start of the pandemic, raising fears the Super Bowl could become a super spreader event. A quarter of U.S. adults who responded to a Seton Hall sports poll said they were planning on gathering with people from outside of their household to watch the game, despite warnings from the Centers for Disease Control. Here in New York, Yankee Stadium is opening today as a max vaccination site in the Bronx, one of the poorest areas of the country, which has the highest COVID-19 positivity rate in New York City. Vaccinations for frontline workers, including restaurant workers, taxi and rideshare drivers, will be limited to Bronx residents to prevent vaccine tourism. On Capitol Hill, Vice President Kamala Harris broke a 50-50 tie in the Senate this morning to approve a budget bill clearing the way for Democrats to pass a coronavirus relief package. The vote capped 15 straight hours of amendment votes in an all-night session nicknamed a vote-a-rama. Overnight, Senate Budget Committee Chair Bernie Sanders deflected a bid by Iowa Republican Joni Ernst to force a vote on immediately doubling the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, which she thought would fail. Sanders' move preserves a bid by Democrats to gradually double the minimum wage by 2025. At least one Democrat, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is on the record opposing a minimum wage of $15. Next week, House Democrats expect to introduce a coronavirus relief package similar to President Biden's $1.9 trillion proposal. Democrats are planning to pass the legislation using using the budget reconciliation process, which needs the approval of a simple majority of the senators, which means it could pass with no Republican support. Dozens of Democratic lawmakers have proposed a resolution demanding President Biden use executive action to cancel up to $50,000 in student debt for all borrowers. Such a move would wipe out student debt for 36 million people. The resolution was unveiled Thursday by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and several progressive House Democrats. This is Congressmember Ilhan Omar.
Millions of Americans can't afford to put food on the table and feed their families. Millions can't pay rent and face housing insecurity. Millions lost their jobs during the pandemic and can't afford basic necessities. The last thing people should be worried about is their student debt.
The House of Representatives voted Thursday to strip Georgia Republican Congressmember Marjorie Taylor Greene of her committee assignments over her history of violent and racist rhetoric. 219 House Democrats voted in favor of sanctioning Congressmember Greene. All but 11 House Republicans voted against taking such action. Ahead of the vote, Congressmember Greene refused to apologize for her past remarks, including support for murdering House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic comments. During an 8-minute speech from the House floor, Greene said school shootings are absolutely real, 9/11 absolutely happened, and claimed she had stopped believing in the QAnon conspiracy theater later in 2018.
What shall we do as Americans? Shall we stay divided like this? Will we allow the media that is just as guilty as QAnon of presenting truth and lies to divide us?
According to the QAnon conspiracy theory promoted by Congressmember Greene, Donald Trump was working secretly to overthrow a cabal of deep state officials and a child sex trafficking ring of satanic pedophiles and cannibals. During Thursday's debate, House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer displayed a poster showing an image which then-candidate Greene shared to Facebook in September. In the photo, Greene brandishes an AR-15 assault rifle next to the faces of Congressmembers Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The post was captioned, "Squad's Worst Nightmare." This is Democratic Congressmember Cori Bush of Missouri, who last month moved her office away from Marjorie Taylor Greene's for her team's safety.
We cannot build an equitable anti-racist education system if a seated House Education and Labor Committee member incites violence through the perpetuation of racist lies in an attempt to overturn an election. We cannot build an equitable anti-racist society if a member of Congress endorses white supremacy.
Before, Congressmember Greene said she believed that the massacres at Sandy Hook and Parkland happened. She had said she believed that they were staged. New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is calling on Congressmember Greene to be expelled from Congress after she sent out a fundraising email filled with lies about progressive Democrats, including that AOC told protesters to punch a cop. Ocasio-Cortez spoke from the House floor Thursday about the danger of ignoring or minimizing survivor accounts of the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol.
Some are already demanding that we move on, or worse, attempting to minimize, discredit, or belittle the accounts of survivors. In doing so, they not only further harm those who were there that day and provide cover for those responsible, but they also send a tremendously damaging message to survivors of trauma.
We'll hear more from AOC later in the broadcast. In related news, former President Trump has refused a House call to testify next week at his impeachment trial in the Senate for inciting an insurrection. The voting technology company Smartmatic is suing Fox News, some of its hosts, and two of Trump's former lawyers, Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, for $2.7 billion, accusing them of spreading lies that Smartmatic helped steal the election from Trump. Giuliani and Powell have also been sued by voting machine manufacturer Dominion for spreading election fraud conspiracy theories. In Brazil, the prosecutor general is investigating the government of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro for possible negligence in its response to the devastating COVID-19 outbreak in the state of Amazonas, which saw hospitals in Manaus run out of oxygen and stretch beyond breaking point. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro has come under attack from officials across the political spectrum after Brazil scrapped its car wash operation, an anti-corruption task force started in 2014. Last year, Bolsonaro announced it was being disbanded because there's no corruption in his government. The Biden administration suspended the deportation of dozens of African asylum seekers at the last minute Wednesday following new allegations that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's ICE agents, tortured them into signing their deportation orders. The Guardian reports the asylum seekers, who are Congolese, Cameroonian, and Angolan, may now be interviewed as witnesses while the allegations are looked into. One of the asylum seekers was reportedly placed in a room with darkened windows as agents grabbed the asylum seeker by the neck and back. They said, quote, "I told them, please, I can't breathe. I asked them to release me. They said that they didn't care. What they need is my fingerprint." A new congressional report has found some baby foods have dangerous levels of toxic heavy metals, including arsenic, mercury, and lead. The House Oversight Panel found these metals in rice cereals, juices, sweet potato puree, and other products made by Gerber, Nurture, Hain Celestial Group, and Beechnut Nutrition. Campbell's Soup, Walmart, and Sprout Foods declined to cooperate in the investigation. The FDA is reviewing the report's findings as the congressional committee is urging stricter standards on baby food. Consulting giant McKinsey has agreed to a $573 million settlement in a lawsuit over the company's work advising Purdue Pharma and other drug makers to aggressively market highly addictive opioid painkillers. The deal, made with 47 states, Washington, D.C., and 5 territories, is the first national settlement as part of sweeping litigation filed by state, county, and local officials in recent years to hold companies responsible for the devastating opioid epidemic. A warning to our audience: the next headline contains disturbing details and images. The incarcerated activist Kinetic Justice, who Democracy Now! Interviewed in 2016 during a nationwide prison strike, was severely beaten last Saturday by guards at the Donaldson Correctional Facility in Bessemer, Alabama. Witnesses say Justice tried to defuse an altercation after guards struck a mentally ill prisoner unconscious with an axe-like baton. Video shows pools of blood and a dislodged tooth in the cell. Both men were airlifted to a trauma center in Birmingham before being returned to prison Monday. Democracy Now! Spoke to Kinetic Justice's mother, Ernestine Council, after he was allowed to call her Wednesday and described his injuries.
And his eye was swollen shut where he had got hit in his eye, and that he had broke ribs, and 2 broke ribs, and bruises where they beat him on the back of his head, his shoulders, his back, and on his side. Those are the injuries that I know that he told me that he had, and severe. They beat him badly, but thank God that he's yet alive.
In December, the Justice Department filed a major lawsuit against Alabama's Department of Corrections for excessive use of force by staff in a dozen prisons after an investigation detailed incidents such as a guard beating a handcuffed prisoner in a medical unit while shouting, quote, "I am the reaper of death, now say my name." Guards involved in last weekend's attack are now on leave, and the FBI may investigate. And in labor and education news, the Chicago Teachers Union and the country's 3rd largest school district remain at an impasse over a return to in-person teaching as teachers consider a possible strike over demands for safe working conditions during the pandemic. The Teachers Union and Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who's pushing to reopen schools, traded barbs Thursday with the mayor, saying talks are moving backwards. This is Mayor Lightfoot speaking at a news conference Thursday.
do the right thing for our kids in this difficult time, black and brown kids who look like me, coming from circumstances like the one that I grew up in, who are struggling and are failing. We are failing those children by not giving them the option to return to school.
The Chicago Teachers Union responded on Twitter, quote, "One of the more disappointing moments from the mayor's press conference was her accusation of fear-mongering when there have been 230,000 positive cases and nearly 5,000 deaths from COVID in her city. How do you explain fear-mongering to those families?" Unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, we go to Ethiopia to speak with the head of the African CDC. African nations are racing to secure vaccines, but it could take months, if not years. Stay with us.
Let's pray. Africa, united we shall be. Congo, Zambia, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Mozambique, South Africa, Senegal, Lesotho, Namibia, Mali, Nigeria, Malawi, Somalia. Let's pray for Africa. United we shall be. Let's pray for Africa.
Prayer for Africa by Omagugu. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today in Africa, where countries across the continent are facing a second COVID-19 outbreak linked to a variant first found in South Africa that many scientists believe is more infectious and has also been detected in Botswana, Ghana, Kenya, and Zambia, as well as more than 20 non-African countries so far. More than 40 African nations have been hit by this second wave, but just 6 have received relatively small quantities of vaccine. There's concern new variants could spread the virus further before widespread vaccination begins. A virtual African Union summit this weekend will focus in part on the continent's response to COVID-19. The outgoing chair, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's own country, accounts for about 40% of coronavirus cases and deaths in sub-Saharan Africa. A Johannesburg nurse recently described the dire situation.
Our mortuaries, as I speak to you, are full to capacity. In fact, it's in the longest where we've seen, body bags on the floor.
On Thursday, U.S. President Joe Biden sent a video message to the African Union summit vowing more cooperation in the fight against the virus.
To reach this future, we also must confront the serious challenges we face. That includes investing more in global health, defeating COVID-19 and working to prevent, detect, and respond to future health crises, and partnering with the African CDC and other institutions to advance health security.
For more, we go to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to speak with Dr. John Nkengasong, director of the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He has said the world faces a moral catastrophe if COVID-19 vaccinations are delayed in Africa while wealthier nations vaccinate their entire populations. Doctor, welcome back to Democracy Now! And congratulations as you mark the 4th anniversary today of the founding of the African Centers for Disease Control.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back with you again.
So can you start off explaining why you've described what could happen in Africa as a moral catastrophe?
I think the situation in Africa is urgent and is critical with respect to the COVID-19. If you look at the second wave of the pandemic, it has really become fiercer than what we observed during the first wave, with a mortality rate now higher than the global case fatality rate. And the rates of deaths, if you see the rates of deaths occurring over the last 1 month, is significantly more than what we observed during the first wave. So unless we have a timely access to vaccines, I'm afraid the situation will be extremely difficult to manage going forward.
Last month, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa urged wealthy nations to stop hoarding surplus doses of COVID-19 vaccines. This is what he said.
The rich countries of the world went out and acquired large doses of vaccines from the developers and manufacturers of these vaccines. And some countries have even gone beyond and acquired up to 4 times what their population needs. And that was aimed at hoarding these vaccines. And now this is being done to the exclusion of other countries in the world that most need this. We are all not safe if some countries are vaccinating their people and other countries are not vaccinating. We all must act together in combating coronavirus because it affects all of us equally.
In a webinar last month about Africa's COVID-19 vaccine financing and deployment strategy, South African President Ramaphosa, who's also the outgoing chair of the African Union that's holding its meeting this weekend, said, quote, "The painful irony is that some of the clinical trials for these vaccines were carried out in Africa." So, Dr. Nkengasong, talk about that. Talk about Africa being used as the experimentation site. But then when it comes to reaping the benefits of the vaccines that prove to be safe, you're last in line.
I think it's unfortunate. When I use the word that we may be heading towards a moral catastrophe, I meant it. In 1996, when drugs to treat HIV were available, it took 10 years before those drugs were finally accessible on the continent. And between 1996 and 2006, 12 million Africans died. And I underline unnecessarily. I think we should really make sure that the history of that sad page of our history do not occur again, especially with this pandemic. So I think we are very, very worried that we may be heading towards that direction if something is not done and done urgently. I think in 1963, Martin Luther King mentioned or characterized the challenges that they had at that time as the fierce urgency of now. I don't know of any situation that we are living with today that doesn't meet that scenario other than rapid and timely access to COVID vaccines broadly, not just in developed world, but in developing countries. And President Ramaphosa and Chairperson Moussa Faki of the African Union Commission are leading a charge to make sure that Africa is really not lagging too much behind. We have secured 270 million doses of vaccines and an additional 400 million doses of vaccines from the Serum Institute in India. So we are making some progress in that, but it will not be easily distributed. We have to mount an extraordinary historic effort to vaccinate up to about 30% of our population before December in order to begin to slow down the spread of the pandemic in Africa. Otherwise, the consequences will be very, very devastating on our continent.
So talk about the deals that must be made with pharmaceutical companies and other countries. I mean, you have places like Canada and the United States that ultimately are ordering hundreds of millions of vaccines. And actually, I think in Canada, it's something like we'll have enough to vaccinate their population 4 or 5 times before you see countries getting vaccines in Africa. So what kind of responsibility does a country like the United States have? Here in this country, people are saying, no, we can't get vaccines. Why should we care about what's happening in Africa? Explain why Africa is so critical.
Africa is so critical because we are part of the globe, and Africa is a continent of 1.3 billion people. And again, we are seeing and witnessing a virus that is spreading very quick. The globe as a whole has recorded more than 100 million cases of COVID-19 in just 1 year. So that is extraordinary. The last time we saw such a fast-moving an impactful virus was in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic. So it is a threat globally. I think it has to be very clear that no part of the world will be safe until all parts of the world are safe. I think we are in this together. We either come out of this together or we go down together. There is no middle ground in this. So that is why the United States, Canada, and other developing worlds must work collaboratively and in a coordinated fashion with the African continent so that we begin to get timely access to the vaccines. The countries that have secured additional or excess doses of vaccines can do a very simple thing and the right thing so that history will remember them right, to reallocate those vaccines into either the COVAX facility or the mechanism that the African Union has put in place so that we can begin to rapidly vaccinate our people. I use the word rapidly purposefully. If we have vaccines later in the year, they become meaningless for us. We have to have vaccines now so that we start vaccinating our people on large scale and then stop the spread of the new variants that you just indicated earlier.
Doctor, could you explain the South African variant? Of course, we're hearing about it in the United States because people are threatened in the United States. How fast it's moving, what it means?
What it means is that we are dealing with a virus that replicates with a lot of errors, the RNA viruses, and the occurrence of mutants in a virus like the COVID-19 virus is not strange. I think it's normal and it should be expected. So what we know is that this virus is currently dominating the pandemic in South Africa, and you've seen how quickly they are spread just over the last couple of months. And South Africa now accounts for about 40% of all infections on the continent. So that also means that the health systems in South Africa will be overwhelmed, are currently heavily overwhelmed by this rapidly spreading virus. What we don't know is if people infected with this virus are dying more. I think maybe, and just maybe, our increased case fatality ratio, which is now around 2.6%, above the global average, which is 2.2%, might be attributed to this variant. We just don't know. So Africa CDC has established a network of what we call the Pathogen Genomic Institute around the continent to try to generate over 50 million genomes in the next 6 months to better understand the spread of these variants across the continent. And it's work that we are very committed to and building the right partnerships to deep dive into these spreading variants.
Dr. Nkangasong, I want to read from the Guardian newspaper. They say that Tanzania has rejected vaccinations altogether, raising fears that the East African country could act as a reservoir for the disease and threaten progress elsewhere. President John Magufuli said last week Tanzania had lived for over 1 year without the virus because our God is able and Satan will always fail, and insisted the pandemic can be fought with herbal remedies. Now, the World Health Organization's Africa chief last week urged Tanzania to share its data on infections. Can you talk about the significance of what Tanzania is doing?
What Tanzania is doing is hugely significant. No country is an island, and Tanzania is a strong member of the African Union. And again, the underpinning of our union is the need to cooperate, to collaborate, and to share with each other to build a united Africa. Those were the founding principles that established the African Union. And a country like Tanzania, with leaders like Julius Nyerere, who were the founding fathers of that country, believe strongly in the unity of our continent. And there is no other time I can recall that is more challenging than it is now because of COVID-19. I think we have to express that unity of purpose and come together as one and fight this virus. COVID-19 would not be eliminated in Africa if we still have pockets of COVID infections in Tanzania, a country of about 60 million inhabitants. It's just not going to happen. So we call on Tanzania to cooperate with the World Health Organization, with the Africa CDC, with the African Union Commission so that we can work hand in hand to eliminate this virus from our continent. We must do that to survive. Otherwise, we'll live with COVID forever on the continent, in addition to HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria that are already a serious threat to our development.
The first shipment of vaccines arrived in South Africa earlier this week. How many vaccines have been acquired by the entire continent? The World Health Organization said on Thursday its COVAX initiative aims to start shipping nearly 90 million COVID-19 vaccine doses to Africa in February. And can you explain what COVAX is?
So COVAX is a multilateral mechanism that was set up in Geneva and is co-managed by the World Health Organization, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, in abbreviation CEPI. So I think it is a response to what I would call an anti-response to protectionism. I think it says that we can pool our resources and then acquire vaccines and distribute it to those countries that are in need of. I think it's a very much welcome initiative, and we continue to be very supportive of that initiative. At the same time, the African continent, the leadership of the African continent, as I indicated earlier, under the leadership of Chairperson Musa Faki Mohammed and the President of South Africa in his capacity as the rotating chair of the African Union, President Ramaphosa, have pulled together what we call the African Vaccine Alliance to acquire more vaccines. And together we've acquired a total of about 700 million doses of vaccines. But let it be very clear that all of those vaccine doses will not arrive on the continent at the same time. Those vaccines will be sequenced over a period of the next 6 months, and it will also spread over to 2022. So I think those vaccine doses, both from the COVAX facility and the African Union, are intended to enable us to achieve a 60% immunization target, which we set up as part of our continental strategy to achieve population or herd immunity. Without that, we will not be able to eliminate COVID from the continent. So we are very encouraged with those numbers, but we have to get prepared. We are working with member states to establish their vaccination plans, establish their vaccination centers, so that once the vaccines arrive, we can easily and rapidly roll out vaccination.
And the significance of President Biden rejoining the World Health Organization. And finally, what is your message for the Biden administration when it comes to vaccine access in Africa?
I was very encouraged to listen to President Biden's message a few minutes ago when you played that. I think the United States leadership has always been determinant and have always been a game changer once they've deployed themselves appropriately, be it in the area of malaria elimination, measles elimination, or HIV/AIDS. The PEPFAR program is a good example of that. So we remain very hopeful and very encouraged by the message and the wordings that we are hearing from the White House with respect to global health security, with respect to the fight against COVID-19 on the continent. Africa CDC stands ready to work with the U.S. government and the U.S. CDC, the USAID, and other parties that have been working with us all through this. So we are extremely encouraged with what we are hearing from the White House.
And what words of advice do you have for the United States? I mean, the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, and yet it has the worst infection rate and the worst death rate, less than 5% of the world's population, but more than a fifth of the world's deaths and infections when it comes to COVID-19.
I believe it's a new day for the United States with a new administration, and we are very encouraged that they respond to the current pandemic in the United States is truly now driven by science, by evidence, and by data. So we are very encouraged with that. I think that is the centrality to fighting any pandemic, is to rely on good science and to rely on good data and to make sure that there's trust between the community and public health experts. I think we at Africa CDC are extremely privileged that we have been working hand in glove with the political leadership of our continent, and we've not run into any challenging issues with that. So when the pathogens do not align, it becomes very challenging. So we are very encouraged that the United States is moving in that direction.
Dr. John Nkengasong, thank you so much for being with us, Director for Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, speaking to us from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Capitol Hill, the U.S. Senate is preparing to begin its impeachment trial of President Trump for inciting the deadly January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Democratic House lawmakers warned on Thursday about the dangers of ignoring or minimizing the violence of the insurrection. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York organized a special session to give lawmakers a chance to talk about what happened that day.
29 days ago, on January 6th of 2021, insurrectionists attacked our Capitol, seeking to overturn the results of our nation's election. 29 days ago, the glass in and around this very chamber was shattered by gunshots, clubs, by individuals seeking to restrain and murder members of Congress duly elected to carry out the duties of their office. 29 days ago, Officer Sicknick, who just laid in honor yesterday in our nation's Capitol, was murdered on the steps just outside this hollowed floor. 2 Capitol police officers have lost their lives since, in addition to the 4 other people who died on the events of January 6th. 29 days ago, food service workers, staffers, children ran or hid for their lives from violence deliberately incited by the former President of the United States. Sadly, less than 29 days later, with little to no accountability for the bloodshed and trauma of the 6th, some are already demanding that we move on, or worse, attempting to minimize, discredit, or belittle the accounts of survivors. In doing so, they not only further harm those who were there that day and provide cover for those responsible, but they also send a tremendously damaging message to survivors of trauma all across this country, that the way to deal with trauma, violence, and targeting is to paper it over, minimize it, and move on.
That's New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking Thursday. Her sister squad member, Congressmember Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, also spoke.
This is so hard because, as many of my colleagues know, my closest colleagues know, on my very first day of orientation, I got my first death threat. It was a serious one. They took me aside. The FBI had to go to the gentleman's home. I didn't even get sworn in yet, and someone wanted me dead for just existing. More came later, uglier, more violent. One celebrating and writing the New Zealand massacre and hoping that more would come. Another mentioning my dear son, Adam. Mentioning him by name. Each one paralyzed me each time. So what happened on January 6th, all I could do was thank Allah that I wasn't here. I felt overwhelming relief, and I feel bad for Alexandria, so many of my colleagues that were here. But as I saw it, I thought to myself, thank God I am not there. I saw the images that they didn't get to see until later. My team and I decided at that point we'd keep the death threats away. We'd try to report them, document them, to keep them away from me, because it just paralyzed me, and all I wanted to do was come here and serve the people that raised me. The people that told my mother, who only had 8th grade education, that she deserves human dignity. People that believed in me. And so it's hard. It's hard when my 7 brothers and 6 sisters beg me to get protection, many urging me to get a gun for the first time. And I have to tell you, the trauma from just being here, existing as a Muslimah, is so hard. But imagine my team, which I lovingly just adore. They are diverse. I have LGBTQ staff. I have a beautiful Muslimah that wears her hijab proudly in the halls. I have Black women that are so proud to be here to serve their country. And I worry every day for their lives because of this rhetoric. I never thought that they would feel unsafe here. And so I asked my colleagues to please try not to dehumanize what's happening. This is real. And you know, many of our residents, from the shootings in Charlottesville to the massacre at the synagogue, all of it is led by hate rhetoric like this. And so I urge my colleagues to please take what happened on January 6th seriously. It will lead to more death, and we can do better. We must do better. Thank you.
Detroit Congressmember Rashida Tlaib speaking on the House floor during her testimony. Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came over and put her hand on her back to comfort her. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. When we come back, President Biden pledges to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war on Yemen, describing it as a humanitarian catastrophe. But will this end the war? Back in 30 seconds.
Was just another young man in the village, leading a simple life of peace and harmony.
Ancient Voices by Chiwoniso Mirare. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. In his first major address on foreign policy, President Biden pledged Thursday to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, which began 6 years ago and was supported by both Presidents Obama and Trump. Biden described the war as a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe.
We're also stepping up our diplomacy to end the war in Yemen, a war which has created a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. I've asked my Middle East team to ensure our support for the United Nations-led initiative to impose a ceasefire, open humanitarian challenge, and restore long dormant peace talks. This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
President Biden's remarks come days after his administration announced it's freezing U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia and examining sales to the United Arab Emirates, including the sale of Lockheed Martin F-35 jets, which were approved by the Trump administration as part of UAE's normalization deal with Israel last year. The 6-year war in Yemen has devastated the country. At least 100,000 people have died, according to the UN. 80% of Yemen's 30 million people need some form of aid or protection. We go now to Lansing, Michigan, to speak to Shireen Al-Adimi, a Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University. Her new piece for In These Times is headlined, "Biden says he's ending the Yemen war, but it's too soon to celebrate." Professor Al-Adimi, welcome back to Democracy Now! That was President Biden's first day visiting the State Department. Can you talk about the significance of this move?
Well, this is the culmination of 6 years of activism and advocacy to end the U.S.'s role in the war in Yemen. As far as victories go, there have been far and few between, but this is probably the most significant victory, if you want to call it that we've had over 6 years, because we have a president who finally acknowledged the devastating war that is frankly caused by the U.S.'s participation, and is committing to end, at least in some form, the war on Yemen. So it's significant, it's important, but as we're going to talk, there are some details that we need to be clear about.
Well, why don't you talk about those details? What are you most concerned about right now?
So in his speech, Biden said that he's ending offensive operations in Yemen, but he went on to commit to defending Saudi borders. Now, this is really concerning to me because I still remember the statement that the White House put out when Obama initially entered the war in March of 2015. And that was the exact same framing, that they were defending Saudi territory from the Houthis. this is what led us here. 6 years of war, over 100,000 Yemenis killed, 250,000 people starved to death, if not more, the entire country destroyed. And the framing was always to protect Saudi borders.
Shireen, let's go to President Biden's exact words.
At the same time, Saudi Arabia faces missile attacks, UAV strikes, and other threats from Iranian-supplied forces in multiple countries. We're going to continue to support and help Saudi Arabia defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity and its people.
Professor Al-Adimi.
You know, he says he wants to defend Saudi people. You know, the Saudis have enjoyed U.S. support for decades, but certainly in the last several years, they have been the biggest customer of arms sales from the United States. If we look at civilian casualties, I can't find a figure of Saudi civilian casualties over 6 years. The missiles from the Houthis did not start until Saudi began bombing Yemen in 2015. And so to frame it as protecting Saudi borders or Saudi territories is very concerning, because if this is what we started off saying, and here's where we ended 6 years later, what does it mean then to continue to defend Saudi Arabian borders? At whose expense? Is it again going to be at the expense of Yemeni civilians? Is the U.S. going to stop supporting some form, providing some supports to the Saudi-led coalition, but not others, for example, like intelligence sharing in the name of defending Saudi Arabia? Are they going to continue providing assistance to the Saudis, let's say with the blockade or with spare parts or with some weapon sales? He also used the word relevant weapon arms sales. So what does it mean to suspend relevant arms sales? Why not all arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE? So those are the concerns that I have. And I really want to be optimistic here, because this means so much to us after so many years of working really hard to end this war. But the details matter for the 30 million Yemenis who are living back home. Is this war going to end for them? We can't really see an end to this war unless the U.S. ends their support, all of it, training, spare parts, weapon sales, logistics, intelligence sharing, their support with the blockade. Until all of this ends, Yemenis are not going to be able to pick up the pieces and to, be able to live freely.
What about in one of his last acts in office, aside from inciting the insurrection, President Trump named Houthis as a terrorist organization?
So everybody seems to agree that this was a misuse of the term, misuse of the designation. The Houthis control areas of Yemen where over 70% of the population live. And so if they are designated as foreign terrorists, then, banks are not going to be able to operate in Yemen. So people like me living here who are sending money back home because 80% of Yemenis need aid to survive, we're not going to be able to do that anymore. All the aid organizations working in Yemen are not going to be able to reach the 80% of the population that needs aid to survive. And so that is just calling for an escalation of mass starvation and mass murder. The Biden administration has said that they are reviewing this policy, which is great news. They have until the end of February to make a decision, but really it needs to be reversed right away so that more Yemenis don't die because of this designation.
And what about still the UAE getting these F-35 fighter planes in exchange for the UAE recognizing Israel? But again, the Biden administration has put that on hold, is looking at that deal. What does the UAE have to do with Yemen?
The UAE is a major partner in the war in Yemen. They have been working alongside the Saudis since day one. They claim to have left Yemen, but really all that meant was that they no longer had UAE soldiers on the ground, but they instead trained mercenaries to continue operating in Yemen. The UAE is all but occupying the island of Socotra in South Yemen. They are supplying the rebel group, the separatist group in the south, the STC, and have been supporting them. They have, control over Yemen's gas plants and whatnot. So they have major ambitions. And of course, they run secret prisons in the south, and they've been involved in assassinations of religious leaders in the south. And so they have been extremely destructive. They are completely part of the coalition, and supplying them with F-35s is not going to do anything except to ensure that they're more capable to continue bombing Yemenis. They also have pilots and have committed planes to the Saudi-led coalition in their efforts to destroy Yemen. And so they're a major party of the war, and we shouldn't be supplying them with any weapons whatsoever, let alone these F-35s.
And finally, Professor Aladimi, the significance of President Biden ending the Muslim ban.
I mean, this is a victory, again, for many people. This should have never happened in the first place. Much like the war in Yemen, these things are easy to designate and so incredibly difficult to reverse. So I think that's a major victory, of course. I was expected that he was going to end that. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. And it has affected Yemenis. Yemen was one of the countries that was listed under that ban. And so Yemenis who are, bombed by the Saudi-led coalition with support from the U.S. were not able to leave the country because of the blockade. And those who were able to leave were not able to join family here or to come to the United States to seek a better life. And so I'm hopeful that this is how he started his administration. And I'm really hopeful that he will continue showing us that he's committed to ending the war in Yemen and to fulfill his campaign promise to end all support for the U.S.-led military with, so that we can begin to talk about justice and accountability, because this isn't going to suffice.
Shireen Aladimi, I want to thank you for being with us. Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University. We'll link to your piece, and in these times, Biden says he's ending the Yemen war, but it's too soon to celebrate. As we end today's show, looking at another foreign policy issue facing the Biden administration. In December, the United States became the first country in the world to recognize Morocco's sovereignty over occupied Western Sahara, what many consider to be Africa's last colony. Morocco has occupied much of the resource-rich territory since 1975 in defiance of the United Nations and the international community. President Trump made the announcement as Morocco agreed to establish diplomatic relations with Israel, becoming the fourth Arab nation to do so in recent months, as part of what's known as the Abraham Accords. During Secretary of State Tony Blinken's first news conference last week at the State Department, the AFP reporter, who's head of the State Department Correspondents Association, Sean Tandon, asked Blinken about the Abraham Accords on Western Sahara.
And with Morocco, does the United States still recognize, as the previous administration said, Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. A couple of things on that. First, as we've said, we very much support the Abraham Accords. We think that Israel normalizing relations with its neighbors and other countries in the region is a very positive development, and so we applauded them, and we hope that there may be an opportunity to build on them in the months and years ahead. We're also trying to make sure that we have a full understanding of any commitments that may have been made in securing those agreements, and that's something we're looking at right now.
That's Secretary of State Tony Blinken. We're joined now by Stephen Zunas, professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco, co-author of Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution. His recent article published in Truthout headlined, "One of the Democrats' biggest hawks is now Senate Foreign Relations chair." So it's clear the Biden administration has not yet made up their mind about whether to draw back from what Trump did, this unprecedented move of recognizing Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara in exchange for Morocco recognizing Israel. Now, Morocco says they're not going to move ahead on Israel unless they know that the Biden administration will continue Trump's move. Talk about the significance of all of this, Professor Zunas.
It'll be very dangerous if Biden does not reverse Trump's unprecedented recognition of Morocco's takeover of Western Sahara. I mean, the United Nations Charter is very clear that the expansion of territory by military force is illegitimate. And Trump already made the dangerous precedent in terms of recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights of Syria. However, the support taking over an entire country brings it to a new level, especially since Western Sahara is recognized by the African Union as a full member state. Over 80 countries have recognized the independent Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. So essentially what Trump was doing was to endorse the takeover of one recognized African country by another. And the failure to reverse this would signal that the Biden administration shares the Trump administration's contempt for fundamental international law. There's been a lot of pressure on Biden from both directions. In the Senate, you have everybody from a leading liberal like Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont to a very right-wing Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, saying this is dangerous. It needs to be reversed. At the same time, because Trump tied it with Israel, he's been getting a fair amount of pressure to say, hey, you say you support the Abraham Accords, you say you support Morocco's recognition of Israel, you're putting this in jeopardy if you reverse this kind of recognition. So we're at a very critical point right now, and the fact that he hasn't made an announcement yet seems to indicate that it could go either direction.
It's interesting that though he's spoken to a number of world leaders from Japan to Mexico to Canada to Russia, he has not spoken to the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu yet.
Well, it was pretty clear that Netanyahu favored Trump and that the Israeli government has been pursuing policies that the Biden administration has not supported. At the same time, Biden has reiterated that the United States will continue to send billions of dollars of unconditional taxpayer-funded military aid to Israel, regardless of their violations of international legal norms. So I think it's one of these contradictory policies of doing a little finger wagging of Israel about certain things, but knowing that the U.S. is really not going to do anything about it, about their policies. But in terms of the lack of a phone call, I think it does indicate that relations will be somewhat frostier in certain respects. But again, I think that this idea that it's a great triumph for these authoritarian Arab states to recognize Israel in exchange for things like massive arms sales or supporting the recognition. It's not really a step towards peace, especially since, of course, the fundamental problem, the reason there isn't peace is not because of non-recognition per se, but the fact that the Palestinians are still under occupation and have not been allowed an act of self-determination, just as the people of Western Sahara have not been allowed an act of self-determination.
Professor Zunis, in the last minute we have, you've written about the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken's record. Can you share a moment of it with us?
Unfortunately, like Biden, he is very much of a hawk. He was a passionate supporter of the invasion of Iraq, and like Biden, who chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Blinken was the chief staffer, he only allowed a day and a half worth of hearings on this, the most important foreign policy issue of the past quarter century, and stacked the witness list with war supporters. Blinken was also a big supporter of U.S. intervention in Syria and in Libya. And he's been a big supporter of the Israeli government and its policies. And so, unfortunately, will not. Sometimes the State Department has been a moderating force of more hawkish presidents, as has the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Both Menendez and Foreign Relations and Blinken, Secretary of State, are if anything, to the right of Biden. So I think that leaves us in the grassroots to challenge the administration policy to make sure it doesn't get us into trouble in terms of impetuous interventionist policies and supporting dictatorships and occupying armies.
Stephen Zunis, we want to thank you for being with us, Professor of Politics and International Studies at the University of San Francisco, co-author of Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution. To see our documentary on Western Sahara, go to democracynow.org. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced with Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Tarasena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Shireen Andura, Sam Alcoff, Tamer Studio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Adriana Contreras. Special thanks to Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman.